Thank you very much. I'll just shift over here to my own presentation, which will be here. It's a great privilege and a great honor to be here and accept the nomination for this extraordinary professorship. I'm deeply thankful to the Northwest University, to Optentia, for granting me the possibility of do some good in your society also. I come from Denmark, where I have been working as a researcher now for 20 years within the field of educational psychology and positive psychology, and I was the president for 4 years of the European Network for Positive Psychology, which has gained me great insight into what's going on around not only Europe, but around the world. We have biennial conferences with about 700 participants. On average, this year in Amsterdam, we were 950 from more than 50 countries. So it's a broad background. And I have been thinking about education since I was a child. Why is it not more fun than it is when we learn so much and remember so much when it's fun? Why are so many experiencing that the natural inborn desire to learn does not survive meeting education? What's going wrong there? And there are many explanations from that, but some of the most interesting ones are coming from psychology, because we begin to understand really in detail the micromechanics, you may say, or the microprocesses of human flourishing, and what is going wrong in these microprocesses sometimes when education doesn't function. We know that an engaged learner at any time will be more proficient and more likely to succeed as a bored learner. There's no reason to accept boredom in the long run. It's important to be bored because it's an important information telling you that you're wasting your life, but to accept it as a state of mind would be to go too far. So let me share some ideas with you about how to bring life to education with a little luck, and how to merge these ideals of fairness, well-being, and performance that education, of course, is all about. First, a bit of background. I want, first of all, to express my deep gratitude to 3 colleagues which I've been working with for almost 2 decades now. Howard Gardner, of Harvard University, Bill Damon from Stanford, and Mike Csikszentmihalyi, the father of flow, from Claremont Graduate University. And we have been working on this project together where we try to understand how you can have engagement and technical professional excellence and a high level of ethical standards at the same time. Without them, I wouldn't be here. I'm sure I would not. They have been mentors for me for 2 decades now. I also want to represent the IPA Board of Directors. The IPA Board of Directors are people from all over the world who are organizing and directing the International Positive Psychology Association. And there's also representation from South Africa, from Marie Wissing. She skipped class this day, as you can see. She's not there, but we found ways to work around that. So here we have her in spirit. And my first point is about nature. If we look at nature and we look at learning processes as organic processes, nature is of great inspiration to us. Nature holds not only many secrets, but also many cues to what can be done to bring life to education. Since learning processes are organic, the agrarian culture is a much better metaphor for learning than the industrial society. But very often, of course, we realize that we find ourselves in learning settings that are optimized for mass production and designed by industrial standards and ideas of mass production, completely disregarding that no human being is completely similar to anybody else. We are all unique, and completely disregarding that throughout life we are living completely individual experiences. So we have a challenge there alone. Nature also tells us about what's make lives worth living. You don't have to argue your case when you say that this is meaningful or beautiful or deep or interesting or other kinds of things. It just goes without saying. We are natural-born learners. And we may say also when children obviously want to learn from the first day, it's a clear signal to all of us that we cannot forget that non-learning is boring by definition. You don't have a life if you don't experience new stuff all the time. So learning per se is a gift, and we should cherish that, of course. And this goes, of course, for South Africa also, which this is supposed to be. Now, there are problems in education apart from those I've already alluded to. Maybe the deepest problem is the problem about agency, whether you assume agency or you don't, whether you assume the role of being an active individual in this universe or you don't. And it's enormously important to understand that if you have citizens, children, young people, adults who have learned helplessness and who have given up and in spirit are passive, they are self-destructive. There may be all kinds of unfairness explaining why they are in these seemingly helpless situations. But if they accept learned helplessness, they are making things even worse. So whether or not we maintain the inborn agency we all come into the world with or not is a question. Do we feel like an alienated citizen on a pale blue dot in the outskirts of a remote galaxy devoid of any meaning? Or do we want to feel as this ever-unique center of consciousness in the universe, actively making meaning and of ultimate importance, as no one else has one's unique potential? Many years ago, I was at a meeting in Boston where Mike Csikszentmihalyi was also, and there was a break, and I asked him, Mike, I find it easy to be in flow when I read, but it's rather difficult for me when I write my academic stuff. Do you have any advice for me? And he says with his Hungarian accent, he says, you can put a skull next to your computer. And I say, what? You can put a skull, a cranium next to your computer. And I ask, why would I put a cranium next to my computer? Because then you can ask yourself, do you want to write or not? So this is a good idea of what agency is that you get from such wise talk. And we have some pointless problems in education also, apart from what I already alluded to. We have too much passivity, too much learned helplessness, too much just empty eyes staring out in the room in education, even though there's no evidence pointing towards the fact that this should be a good idea. It's only damaging those involved in that. There's too much boredom, and like I said, boredom is a good thing in the short run because it tells you you're wasting your time, but it's not good to accept it because who wants to live a bored life? If you have a bored day and somebody asks you, you want to live this day once more? You have a chance to live this day once more? The answer should be yes. It wouldn't be if it was a boring day, of course. What are we doing? There's too much anxiety. Anxiety in the long run can be, in the short run, can be fun. If you're in a game park or you're in a roller coaster or you're playing a computer game, feeling the danger is fun. It's even fun if you have your adrenaline up a little bit because we are optimized for acute stress. But after a few hours, the cortisol becomes toxic, as you know, and our minds close down and start learning less and performing worse. And there's a lot of social tension in education also because there's this idea of not room enough on the train for everyone, so it's kind of a selection game. And of course, even though there's some harsh truth to that, if that's the basic culture, you can't expect young people to be very nice to one another. If what really counts is whether you can outcompete your friends and peers. And there's meaningless discipline. And meaningless discipline is the kind of discipline where you don't understand why you're doing it, but you're just doing it because you have to do it, and somebody says you have to do it. You don't understand the point of it. It's self-destructive because we lose our self-respect in time, and we lose our future perspective in the sense that you don't want to continue doing what you don't like in the first place, of course. And this has to, discipline is fine, but it has to be meaningful discipline, which is, of course, the mother of all deeds. And there's too much failure. And failure is fun if it's in football and you can get up and move on, and it doesn't matter. But failure in the long run and continued failure creates a negative self-fulfilling prophecy, in that you develop this negative sense of self-efficacy, the conviction I can't do anything even though I do my best. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. All of this is leading learners away from learning, out of flourishing, teaching helplessness. And this is from the individual point of view. If we look at the system point of view, there are a few things I want to mention also that are challenging. One thing is really biological. By evolutionary instinct, we compete for status vertically, we try to get up, and for territory, horizontally, we want to expand our territory. Like all species, all individuals, we have these instincts in us. And you can play to that. If you are in economy, or you're in politics, you're in sports, whatever, you can play to the fact that people actually sense that competition is an important thing, and they want to compete for that. And of course, education is greatly marked by this also. But we don't have sound competition in education in the natural sense. It should be competition that's not driving people out of the game. What do I mean by that? I mean by that in nature, sound competition implies that the weak die and get eaten. You can have students die and get eaten. Indeed, the political claim is 180 degrees opposite, a reverse of this social Darwinism, where you want every child to succeed, you want everybody on board, everybody having a fair game in education. In Denmark, where I come from, it's now illegal to hurt people in educational processes, in the sense that all children, by political agenda, have the right to thrive in school. This is actually a historical turnaround, if you look at millions of years where the weak died and get eaten. But competition can be too much still, and if we, for instance, have standardized testing overdone, and again I want to stress that tests can be fun. If you play a football game and you don't test whether you score, you don't want to play. If you play computer and you don't see your score, you don't want to play. Indeed, you can make the point that our whole being, with our sensory system, evaluating what's going on in the environment second by second, is one big evaluation mechanism. You couldn't do without that. But standardized testing often comes with social stigma. And that means that it easily creates this sense that only the best is good enough, and leading a lot of people to the conviction that an ordinary life is meaningless, that it doesn't count if you don't have your own TV show. You know, who tells you? Well, these statistics may indirectly do so, if only the very best are in the limelight. So this is a democratic, this is a human development challenge where psychology can also inform now. We should all aim to do our best, to be our best, of course, but we should also have this community sense of getting everybody on board. This is not the deep Stone Age anymore. And here's a quote from Boston professor Peter Gray, who hates school actually, but who says this, at least, that I will use here: longer school years aren't the answer. The problem is school itself. The boredom is not about much or less. If you have a good time in school, it doesn't matter if you have a long school day. It's if the quality is low or if you don't learn much that you have this problem. And stress is part of education in many places, not only for children and young people, but also for the adults. And many have this sense of not really being in themselves, this sense that life is somehow living itself somewhere, and I'm just trying to hold on to it, but I'm not really there. And if you think about mindfulness, that's a way to get back and, hey, accept it, you are there. Or if you think about flow, where you're immersed in an activity, you don't sense that you're behind life also, you sense that you're immersed in life. And if you think about savoring and appreciating the beauty and great things in life, also the small things. It's not like this either. So there are some techniques that are about focusing and taking back control and agency that are well documented now as ways to go about that problem. But it doesn't solve the structural problems, of course. And there are structural problems explaining this. And it's important when we use psychology in school context to understand that psychology is not only about what happens in individuals, it's also indirectly about what the surroundings are doing to individuals. And by psychological evidence, we can document what surroundings are doing to individuals. So when you have satisfaction with life in Denmark with at a score 8 out of 10, and you have Togo with 4 out of 10. This is not genetic or anything. It's only to be explained by structural differences, poverty, corruption, and danger in daily life. And we are urbanizing the world now in a way that is about as far from the natural ideals as we can imagine. Every week, 1 million people is moving into a metropolitan area in the world. Every week. The best thing about it, I would say, is that infancy, the number of born babies decreases very sharply towards 2.0. So the population explosion is greatly hampered by that. But it doesn't have much to do with what people basically prefer the most, if they have the means to do so, namely be in cozy neighborhoods where you have the sky is big and you have some spaces outside, some gardening and to do, and you are close to nature. This is a big thing, and we call it competence, we call it growth, we call it competitiveness, we call it global development, and so on. And we have to ask ourselves if this material development has an immaterial correlate to it. Does our mood go up at the same time? Do we feel better by moving into the metropolitan areas? Chris Peterson, who was one of the pioneers of the character strengths classification, did a study in the United States showing that people in big cities were more desperate than people outside the big cities. He didn't know what way the causality went, whether it was the desperate that went to the cities or you became desperate by being in the city, but one way or the other, it's not that good if 1 million people move in every week. And I love this quote by a psychologist, David Myers, who wrote a book in 2000 called The American Paradox, and I'll just read it to you. More than ever, we at the end of the last century were finding ourselves with big houses and broken homes, high incomes and low morality, secured rights and diminished civility. We were excelling at making a living, but too often failing at making a life. We celebrated our prosperity, but yearned for purpose. We cherished our freedoms, but longed for connection. In an age of plenty, we were feeling spiritual hunger. And there are problems in positive psychology that relates both to the individual level and to the structural levels that I like to look at. These questions are from a book I published last year, and that, to everybody's surprise, has been on the bestseller list, the top 10 bestseller list of nonfiction in Denmark for an entire year now, actually more than a year. And nobody understands why people want to buy nonfiction. But here are some of the questions in the book. Why do negative experiences, almost without exception, accept us more than positive when everybody prefer the positive? We have answers to that. Why do many experience loss of influence when subjected to leadership, even though disengaging leadership is doomed to fail? Why do weaknesses of others so often bother us when intelligent organizing obviously requires weakness made irrelevant? Why do we accept being disturbed 24/7 when none of the best experiences in life are marked by distraction? All the best, if you ask people to think about the best things in life for them, none of them think of examples where they're all distracted and disturbed. And now young people have to carry a mobile telephone in order not to socially exclude themselves, more or less. It's not to argue against mobile cell phones, but it tells us that there's a challenge. Why do we often accept being disciplined without understanding a legitimate reason, when meaningless self-discipline without doubt erodes feeling of self and personal character? Why do many hesitate taking chances when indeed it's difficult to feel anything unless you improvise? If you have a sensory input and it doesn't change within 15 seconds, you stop taking in anything. If you have a piece of paper, you make a cross on this piece of paper, you stare at it for 15 seconds, please notice that the world disappears. It's just too boring, too little happening. Retina stops sending information further. Nothing happening here. Why do we most often have to be sick before getting psychological help when everybody agrees that it's both cheaper and better to prevent than treat? Of course, that's the foundation for creating such a thing as positive psychology, that, you know, we haven't been taken in until the damage was done. Now we can use psychology before the damage is done. So what kind of theory do I work with to address these questions? These are just examples, but well-chosen examples on my behalf. One kind of theory comes from nature and system theory. If we look at traits of nature and look at what's going on in nature, and you ask a chemist or a physicist or biologist, they say, well, maybe only two types of processes are going on in the universe. One is growth processes, and the other is self-regulating processes. There you are. Those of you working with organizational theory and maybe remembering the learning organization theory around Peter Senge from the 90s will know that they built their work on Jay Forrester's system theory, where they had these archetypes, and there were basically only 10 types of archetypes between human beings in which we interacted, they said, and they were all archetype built on two types of processes, and namely growth processes and self-regulating processes. And if we take a metaphor like this broom plant in May in Denmark as a metaphor for flourishing, for human flourishing, and it's easy to understand why flourishing became a word for the human unfolding. It is clearly a self-organizing plant. It's clearly a growing plant. And it's also, I would note here, a strength-based plant. This broom plant doesn't assume to be a giraffe or a bird or something. The genome tells it you're a broom plant. Play to your strength. And this means that we may define flourishing at root, at also being marked by these, or defined by these three principles: self-regulation, strength-based growth. And I would submit to you that if we look at the different types of well-being that Professor Rothman was mentioning, for instance, and Toumi Kamalo has worked with, or even Linda Theron's work on resilience and all, these different kinds of well-beings and these strengths all somehow relate to this deeper principle of self-regulation and growth. And maybe this, in psychology, the idea of self-regulation and growth is best and most comprehensively understood through the work of Professor D.C. and Ryan in the self-determination theory, where this flourishing principle comes into human life as a foundational quality in life. And this is just to give you another example. Nobody doubts that what we see here is self-regulated, strength-based, and it's growing. And that means if we try to make a system model of human flourishing based on this basic factor, or these basic factors, we may assume now that the satisfaction of basic needs for self-regulated, strength-based growth lies at root of human flourishing and human thriving. And the symptoms of that are many, but to relate to the well-being research, we may say that if you have physical health, experience that is a symptom of a body able to self-regulate. Like if you get a bee sting, you can activate your antibody, and if they're not effective enough, you can raise your temperature, and then they'll be more active, and eventually you would fight off the alien elements in your body. So autonomy is a good candidate for a definition of a body able to self-regulate or able to maintain health. And of course, it's intrinsically motivated. People want to be healthy. They don't need to be paid to be that. Positive emotions are others. Positive emotions is what you get if you have sensory pleasures, if you have satisfaction of basic needs also. And of course, the needs are something that you want to regulate towards satisfying. And so it's intrinsically motivated also. If we look at engagement, the same thing. If children are in flow, if adults read books, if young people play games, are engaged in projects, of course, they forget themselves, and they have this intrinsically motivated state of mind called flow or playfulness or whatever, which of course is based on what they are doing well. Of course, is a quintessential learning situation to be in, and typically build on strength, because you are likely to have more good experiences if you work on your strength. If you find meaning in life, this too has these basic elements of self-regulation and strength-based growth in them. Meaning is about growing beyond yourself. It's about transcending yourself. It's about being something for others, seeing yourself as part of something much bigger than yourself. It's also more meaningful if you can see yourself playing an important role than if you see yourself as marginal, which means that the strength part becomes important there also. And of course, by definition, you grow. If you have a meaningful project, if you are hopeful, it's like Tumi is talking about, for a project, and actually being able to conduct what you have set yourself for, it's a growth process that you're in there. So we see it there. And we see it in social relatedness. If a person is related, of course, it's easier to be related if you're good at something, because you're more interesting for other people than if you're weak, of course. Not that you can't have care from others, but of course, strength plays in there also. And of course, if you have friends, they're typically better friends if they're voluntarily chosen than somebody you are forced to be with, even though the last also may be a success, but you want to choose your own relations. So there you have the self-regulation for you. And typically friendships and relations and so on, they are difficult to maintain if there's not a developmental component to that also. If you say the same thing every time you meet, how long are you going to meet? Now, if this is part of your experience in education, if this is part of the experience in school, the pupils or whoever experiences this will also experience life as interesting. And what does that mean? That means that we want more of it. What are the symptoms of wanting more of life? Well, two archetypical examples are these two complementary types of psychological energy. Curiosity, which is this energy, this drive, this desire to soak in more of the world and understand more of what's going on, and complementary to that, the urge to act, to do something, to use what you have learned, to make a difference in the world, to be acknowledged for that. And if that is the state of the mind of the young people in school and beyond, of course, it's just, open the gates and learning will happen and creativity will happen, and success is likely to happen because you're unfolding yourself to your optimal. You're optimizing your potential. And success is both in the sense of being competent in something, but also in using what you know in new and novel ways, a creative way. And please note that can you see it? Yeah. Well, please note that there's a complementary relation between competence and creativity also, in the sense that if you're competent, if you've learned something, if you're good at something, you're also able to employ these capacities in new and novel ways creatively. But there's also reinforcement the other way. If you're creative, you will be engaged in some kind of project. And the way our memory works is that you're likely to remember what you use, called use it or lose it principle. And when you are creative, you know by instinct that you need knowledge to go far with your creativity. So you get better memory. You get improved memory by being creative, It's not either or, it's both and. And because this is a wonderful process, of course, this is also self-reinforcing. You acquire a desire to learn more, you acquire a desire to create more. And this makes this idea of well-being what you could call a sustainable psychology. There's a sustainability in this in the sense that you're not draining future resources for learning, you're actually improving them. And you can make the analogy to ecologies and biology also in the same thing. And one more thing I want to mention is that please note that well-being is not only a result of high performance, it's also a precondition for it. So if you have trouble in school, so, well, try to feel good. Try to, but first I have to perform. Yeah, but take care of yourself. Make sure you're... And one way that from my own experience and something we do much in Denmark is to actually teach stuff like this to the pupils so that they understand these mechanics. And you can tell them, well, if you don't like German, why don't you make it fun? How can I do that? Here, make it like a computer game. It's impossible. Well, not quite. There are people that actually make a living who choose a profession with German grammar. Where did that come from? Somehow there must be a key to enjoying that stuff. So, had I more time, I would tell you what can be done in order to further this. And maybe I should, but I know I'll just show you that these yellow boxes here, they are the preconditions for actually bringing this about. This is what leaders and teachers and parents can do for that. So what about physical health? What does positive psychology tell about physical health? Well, nutrition is important for you. Movement is important for you. Sonja Lyubomirsky, for instance, argues that maybe physical exercise may be the best booster of mood of all. 3 times, 35 minutes, hard exercise a week is just as effective as the best Prozac. So there you have it. You can run or you can take pills. Sleep is important. If you don't sleep enough, you can almost be certain that the day after you will be in a lower mood than you would otherwise. And hygiene, of course, which I will not go into. What are the conditions for positive emotions, basically? A good social atmosphere, safety, trust, includedness. Aesthetics, beautiful surroundings make for beautiful thoughts, and so on. And functionality, this is maybe the most important. Short waiting times, short delays. It doesn't matter if you're bored as long as you can do something about it. It doesn't matter if you're frustrated, wonderful, as long as you can do something about it. The functionality should be there. So if you need to go to the bathroom, it's good if there's one there. If you need blood sugar, it's good to have an apple. If you need wireless, it's good if there's connection, and so on. These are the flow conditions that I won't go into, but these are very well documented preconditions for deep immersion and engagement. And this is about meaning. How to create meaning. 2 levels, I would say. In the short run, meaning is about usability. If you can see what you can use this for, it carries the meaning in itself. Nobody asks questions. It's obvious. If you don't know, why you should learn about Islamic State or something because it's so far away. You can explain to your pupils what happens if you have a dictatorship and what happens if you can't argue against authorities anymore. And they'll know. And that becomes meaningful through that also. And regarding relatedness, so much could be said, but I would stress these 2 complementary dimensions, that social support is important, to feel taken care of and accepted. That's important. But positive social challenge is equally important. And we often forget that because we have this idea that if we disagree, we get in conflict and we stop meeting. It shouldn't be like that. Indeed, it would be the worst thing of all if you had to go to a meeting and there was no opposition at all. Imagine going to a meeting where everybody was clapping your shoulders and saying exactly what they normally say, and there was no surprise and no challenge at all. It would be intolerable. The only reason we want to meet, of course, is that there's some kind of surprise and challenge. But because of this negativity bias that's so well documented by Roy Baumeister and other of his colleagues, we know that challenge and opposition is likely to make a much bigger impact on you than support. And if that is not handled in the culture, very soon this negativity that you feel when you get opposition grows beyond its borders, and you just start talking about it. We can't control it. But indeed, if you think about flow, for instance, where a child is optimally challenged, it's a situation where you're actually close to making mistakes all the time, and you do make mistakes. And if you don't, in a computer game, for instance, you would turn up the level until you start making mistakes, because it's just not funny if it's not dangerous. So we need this challenge, and I'll go a bit deeper into that. Together with Tumi Kamalo and Ian, I will be discussing a project that's coming out of Denmark now, and that possibly could be something for you to collaborate on. There's a number of indicators here based on the model before, but also beyond that, that is related to a new event in Denmark, namely that from September 2015, all Danish school children will be surveyed for their well-being. It's never happened before, but the legislation now tells you that every child has the right to thrive in school, and now politically they want to survey that. I hope this survey doesn't lower their mood, because that's what surveys often do. But the indicators here you can see are very much in line with the model before, and I am preparing a survey together with Tumi, a tentative survey, see if that could work, or in part work with you. And here you have the items or the categories from the model before, and then there are two types of questions that also form this complementary relation. One type of generic question is about how well do I contribute to my own and others' well-being. That would be relating quite closely to Ruud Veenhoven's idea of lifeability. You know, am I assuming responsibility for my life? Am I employing my powers to actually do something about whatever I think is necessary? And complementary to that, how well does the environment support my own and others' well-being as regards? And this is a question, this is a generic question about livability. And these two perspectives can be applied to any of these categories, of course. And you can see many of the categories that you work with and you publish so widely within are also related to this. So this is just to give you an idea of why I'm also so interested in Optentia. Optentia is a great thing, and I really hope you go a long way with that. For myself, this is just a picture of a project that became very prominent in Denmark. It was a television program, 6 episodes, where we took 9 8th graders and who couldn't read, which reading level was at the 2nd grade or 3rd grade. And we gave him a crash course. We selected a teacher, gave him a crash course in teaching, grammar, and spelling, and then within a month, we took these children, I won't go into detail with the project, but we took these children on a camp and gave them 1 month of intensive broad spectrum positive psychology, strength-based, wellness-based, well-being-based intervention. And the result was absolutely stunning. The 3 weeks that it effectively was showed a dramatic increase in reading skills and well-being. The reading skills typically improved 3 or 4 years for these children, and they maintained that afterwards when we looked at it a year later. The television program was extremely popular in Denmark, getting 33% a share, 33% of all Danish viewers in primetime television. Very high viewer rating. There was almost no drama in this. The television people wanted drama. We didn't need that. It was more than dramatic enough to see these young people struggling against a dire future, because there was no family in Denmark who didn't know somebody or had a member who had experienced this themselves, and who knew what was going to happen if they don't somehow got out of this destructive process that they were in education. Their teachers thought it was impossible. Some of the teachers said that, I don't think he will do much in school. We've tried for a long time, and for the last couple of years we didn't have a special need training for him at all, so it's probably not going to work for him. And to see them, to interview these teachers afterwards, and just watching these blossoming children was just fantastic, moving, and had a huge impact. It wasn't a generalizational project in the sense that it could just be generalized to everybody. But what it was a fantastic anecdote showing that the hypothesis that was the popular hypothesis, that nothing could be done for these children, they just don't have it, was falsified. That's sort of enough. And we got no criticism from reading professors and so, because if they had criticized it, we have something better than that. They knew that the response would be, then why didn't you apply it earlier? So this is only very superficially presented to you, but this was actually a big deal in Denmark. And just to show what we did later with a lot of young people, we evaluated 10,000 pupils with these types of indicators and earlier versions of these questionnaires. And here are, for instance, results on one school that did this project, where you can see green is equal to high level of thriving, yellow is so-so, and red is not so good, blue is missing. I won't go into detail with that, but this is, here for instance are 6,000 4th to 10th graders, where we look at them in 2009, 2010, look at average scores, look at standard deviation. Standard deviation is actually educationally interesting in the sense that the more you have of it, the more unfair it is in a way. The less you have of it, the less unfair it is, so you can use that. But this, I won't go into detail with that, just tell you that what we did on television was later applied to a whole municipality in 35 schools, and also with good results. We actually, what you can see out there, the green column here, is that on these 40 indicators, we managed to raise the average on every indicator among these 6,000 pupils, and the same went for the the smaller children, where we had 4,000, so that was 10,000 pupils altogether. I won't go more into detail with that. Here's my daughter, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, with a snake, and I want to return a bit to nature and talk a bit about free play, which is the way we learn by nature most deeply. She's now a law student at the University of Melbourne, and she's into her third boyfriend, which looks somewhat similar, but I'm very proud of her. And I want to focus on free play, because free play is really a key to much of this, even though free play often comes before school. Indeed, it shouldn't. Here's a quote I will read to you. It's from Peter Gray again, who I mentioned before. And he has extensively researched free play from an evolutionary point of view, doing anthropological studies and so on. But he's written, I think, the most used psychology textbook in the U.S. He's written the textbook that Steven Pinker is using in his 101 course whenever he has one. So he's a good guy. To a degree, I guess. And I like his thoughts about this very much. He says, over the past 50 years, free play with other children has declined sharply. Over the same period, anxiety, depression, suicide, feelings of helplessness, and narcissism has increased sharply in children, adolescents, and young adults. The decline in play has continued to rise in the psychopathology of young people, and contributed to that. Play functions as a major means in which children develop intrinsic interests and competencies, learn how to make decisions, solve problems, exert self-control, follow rules, learn to regulate their emotions, make friends, learn to get along with others, and experience joy. And should I add, learn to concentrate and not get ADHD. Through all of these effects, play promotes mental health. So, and the reason play is important here is because it can be argued that it's actually our preferred state of being throughout life. And let me just briefly make that point. Free play seems to be the most important activity through which children acquire and strengthen personal competencies. That's another way of putting what Peter Gray was saying. Thus, during free play, children learn genuine initiative, genuine responsibility. Not only you have to do because we say so. No, they feel and experience that I can't blame my action on anybody else because I initiated them. So that's true responsibility that you see. Passion, which is good later on if you lack perspective in life. Perseverance, control of impulses, social limits, social finesse, tolerance of risk, creativity, etc., etc. For 60 years, children's time for free play has declined steadily while documented mental problems have gone up. To be sure, correlation is still not causality, but mental illness is what you would expect if you deprave children of free play. This is important, I think, because there are two reasons for free play to go away. One is urbanization. It's too dangerous to have them out in the streets. And since everybody is in high-rises or some kind of ghettos in the big cities, you know, you're careful not to have your children play and develop. And the other reason is that adults are so worried. There are all these handbooks telling you what you should do if your child should not get behind. And so they're over there, they're surveying these children all the time. And it's never really fun if your parents know where you are compared to if they don't. Many of the best experiences in youth and adult life, like hobbies, journeys, parties, etc., are indeed basically play-like, however structured and directed. And I guess all of you know what flow is, and the flow condition where you have these peak experiences almost, where you're completely immersed in something and time stops or flies, that means the same thing here, are what life is all about. And it's directed while at the same time it is full of life and moving in all kinds of ways and full of unexpected events happening to you, full of unpredictability. And we can see now that this state of mind is preferred because people like hobbies. They like to go on journeys and so on. And you can make the point, as has been done by Alison Gopnik, for instance, from Berkeley, that children are born scientists. They discover and they make hypotheses, and they're common sense hypotheses, but they still make the hypothesis. And that good scientists are often childish, playing with new ideas. The only psychologist I think that ever got a Nobel Prize, Daniel Kahneman, to a large degree could thank his colleague, now deceased colleague, Amos Tversky, for the success in their studies. And Amos Tversky got all his ideas laid back, drinking beer on a sofa, basically. But he had the discipline also, childish, and they were playing with these ideas all through their careers. The scientists in the crib haven't grown up, sort of. And last year in Claremont, we had a IPA board meeting, and one of the people on the picture I showed you was George Valiant. George Valiant is a very prominent aging researcher, and he looked at keys to happy aging. So he's 80 now, and somebody at the meeting immediately asked him, what is the key to happy aging? I'm getting there. And he had 3 answers: play, play, and play, here in the Lego colors. And it's not that you go and sit down and look stupid. It's not that. It's a play-like state. It's being fully engaged. And we were talking about humor before getting in here, and your dean asked what humor is and where does it come from and so on. Well, playfulness is full of humor. It's just one of the ingredients. You can't do without it. And it comes by itself. It's very easy to have great fun. So, don't grow up. It's a trap. And there's another quote I like here that somehow relates to this. Why don't we see this? Why do we forget this? This is John Lennon. When I was 5 years old, my mother always told me that happiness was the key to life. When I went to school, they asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wrote down happy. They told me I didn't understand the assignment, and I told them they didn't understand life. And there's something to that. And if we look at complexity and we look at the scientific worldview, and this is a fantastic model I stole from the Wright Center at Harvard, made by colleague Eric Chasen, we can see how complexity evolved through the eons and how what we call the disciplines in the university now also has a historical representation up there, and how human being only very recently come into the scene, and now we are confronted with these huge challenges. The Astronomer Royal of the United Kingdom, Martin Rees, wrote a book in 2003 called Our Final Hour, where he states that his estimate is that we have 50% chance that there are human beings on Earth at 2100. 50%. And he claims not to be over-dramatizing. So there's something to play for. One way to understand this in a more general way, relating to what I was talking about before, is to make a graph based on this idea that you have two types of processes in the universe: self-regulation and growth, balancing processes and regulating processes. And that could maybe be displayed like this, where you have development taking place by constant differentiation, being integrated in ever bigger wholes. So you have bigger entities, you have bigger brains, you have bigger computers, things are growing. And there's unpredictability connected to differentiation. So if we look psychological to it, there's a lot of experience. There's a lot of experiences connected to new things happening all the time. But there's also this directing, there's also this integration of things where you have things coming together, not falling apart, which is equally important and creates safety and so on. And generically, you could say that this would be a fragile state for a living organism to be in, and this would be a rigid state where you're non-adaptive because you're not able to adapt to the many differences you encounter in the environment. And the reason I just wanted to show this to you was mainly to build a bridge to another model, which is more familiar to you probably, this one, which is an adaptation of the flow model, of Csikszentmihalyi's flow model, which we worked on further, where normally it just says flow here, but where play and learning and creativity and good work can actually be seen as part of the same package. They are not synonyms to flow, but it's close. And the flow condition very, very much summarizes many of the ideals that I have indirectly alluded to in this lecture, in the sense that when you are in flow, new things happen all the time. You are challenged by something, giving you this unpredictability, opening your senses to experience. If there's no unpredictability, as I said before, your senses will, within few seconds, habituate to the input and you won't see anything. It very quickly becomes boring or apathetic. Please note that monotony is without experience. You don't experience anything through monotony in itself. So that's important. But then also, what do you meet those challenges with? Well, with the skills that you have, the competencies that you have. And they're more directing in the sense that they give you calm, they give you confidence, they tell you that bring it on, I know what I can do, I tried it before, and so on. So even though skills are monotonous in the situation that you don't develop them right here and now when you're confronted with a new challenge, only when you engage in the challenge, they're still equally important. So this is a special case. The flow model is really a special case regarding consciousness of the model I showed you before, which is a generic model that you can use at all systems levels. And just to give you a few words about why this is an ideal state for educators to assume also. Flow, of course, is valuable in itself. Just to be in flow is worthwhile, of course, and it's portrayed by Csikszentmihalyi to be a state of optimal psychological experience. So that's worthwhile. It sounds like an exotic ideal, but like I said about playfulness, it's not an exotic ideal. We are born to play. All mammals play. All young mammals play. And there are now about 5,500 mammal species on the planet. All their young play, which tells you something about how important it is to employ the possibility of learning opened through this playfulness if you want to continue in evolution. It's not for fun that you play. It's fun to get you to learn, you know. And playfulness, and this leads us to this point here, namely that it's extremely learning rich to be in this flow situation, in the sense that you challenge yourself up to your optimal level, in which you will employ your talents optimally while at the same time be completely focused on the substance. Goes without saying that you have the quintessence of effective learning in that situation. And it's creative in the sense that you're close to this line, which you could call the line of which you cross that, you start making mistakes. And because you're close to that line, where you start making mistakes, when you're in flow, you will often also transgress this line and make mistakes. And then you have obviously to learn from your mistakes. So that's a very inventive situation to be in, where you constantly play with new ideas. And looking at children playing, of course, it goes without saying that creativity is part of what they're doing when they're building all this stuff through their play. So here you train entrepreneurial spirit and innovative powers and creativity and idea generation, and all these things happen at the same time. And finally, I put this up here because if you experience this during school, during education, you will also have a sense that your surroundings are good to you, in that they allow for all this. And the way we function morally is that we reciprocate that goodness coming to us, so that we are less likely to cut corners, we are less likely to deceive others, we're more likely to assume responsibility also in situations where we're not being monitored, and so on, simply because we want to do good. Then what if we're bored? What if the students are bored? Well, great, because that's extra capacity to be employed. But it's not great to stay there, of course, because if you stay there, you get stressed and you lose your interest gradually. And what if we're anxious? Great too. It's fun to be anxious, as we know from small children, you know, or computer gamers, you know, or sports. You don't want to know that you have won the game beforehand. You know, you want to have an almost equal opponent, so that there's this openness in the process, and the same goes, of course, for computer games and all kinds of other things. And anxiety is fun also if you do the roller coaster thing that I was talking about before. You know, you're up here and you're making mistakes, and the roller coaster, you know, it's you're sensing death, but you have these straps on, so you survive. And so it's fun to have this experience on the short run, but and we're good to have we are good at having these strikes of anxiety in the short run, because we have this acute stress system that saved our lives through millennia. But as you all know, and I said it before, we are no good at prolonged stress. We cannot deal with it, and we destroy our own body when that happens. So if we are over-challenged, if we are an over-challenged student, the best thing to do, of course, is rise to the occasion, quickly add competence. But if it's structurally determined, in the sense that it's just too much, I can't take it as such. We have to lower the expectations, we have to lower the degree, not to compromise ideals, but to get back to an optimally functioning state where performance also will be optimal. And where you have that sense of sustainability, in the sense that you tend to want more of this if you want. You don't want more of this. This is shying you away. You don't want more. Here you have this self-reinforcing process going. So you may say that self-regulated growth is a quintessential key to well-being and well-functioning, also in school and education, we may say. So what's the future of positive psychology? Well, I would say it needs to be two things, at least. It needs to be systemic, studying and furthering individuals, groups, societies ecologically, recognizing the basic interdependence of the world. One of the most reasonable criticism of positive psychology relates to the fact that we sometimes disregard the context that we're in, even though the context means the worlds of difference also. You can brutalize people into helplessness, as we know from our own studies, in a very short time, by creating brutal enough circumstances. We cannot disregard that. And generally improving the social capacity of combining openness and skepticism. And these two ideals, I think, are immensely important for any society to develop. Of course, there's nothing new in that, but often we are almost indoctrinated not to see them together. Politically, for instance, you have political parties being open to what their own members are saying and skeptical towards everybody else. You may have that in paradigms also within science, and you may have that in economy, where you have firms being loyal to their own people and hostile to everybody else. And so it's not an automatic. It's not automatically induced to people to see these two ideals go hand in hand. But indeed, I think they really should. If we have what we could call a democratic mindset, then true democracy, of course, is about being open to what others are saying and evaluating what they're saying skeptically. These are two virtues that we should all hold up. There's no reason to have a democracy if you know beforehand who's right and who's wrong. So this is part of the game that we don't know, and therefore it's also an irony that politicians so often speak with such loud voices as if they knew everything beforehand, and we may say the same about scientists. It's also about a scientific mind. We all know that good science is about not being prejudiced, being open to new evidence coming in, also if it contradicts what we're saying, but at the same time being skeptical, peer reviewing, trial and tribulating what's coming in there. So I would argue that this is necessary, and it's necessary also. This sounds more like positive psychology than this. Openness, yeah, that's skepticism, no, that's negative. No, it's wonderful to be skeptical. It's just as important to have opponents in football, to have team players playing with you. Nothing works if we don't have that combination. So we have to be very careful with how we use the word. And sometimes positive psychology has been debated. Should they have chosen another word for it? There's just too much explaining to do, and we never really get it across. But I think on the mountain, the view is that it's too late. It's a brand now. We have to live with it. We're sorry. Across sciences, across the political spectrum, most importantly in ordinary life, convincing each other by mutual example that indeed an ordinary life is not meaningless, as the media indirectly tells you. It's a fantastically unique opportunity no one else will ever have, an opportunity one may assume or leave. Do you want to write or not? So, summing up, we're born free to learn, to influence, to create. Basically, we may assume that human beings have inborn tendencies to be active, self-regulating, and growing. For education, this specifically means that pupils, students, are basically motivated to learn curiously, are basically motivated to influence their physical and social surroundings creatively, will learn and assume responsibility for influencing if the necessary possibilities are provided, or in other words, will be able to learn and influence unless inhibited in doing so. And there are inner inhibitors to learn and to influence. Here are some important examples. Physical illness, mental illness, low mood, languishing, depression, concentration problem, lack of perseverance, willpower, a lack of willpower, self-inhibiting thoughts, low self-efficacy, lacking sense of meaning, purpose, perspective, interest in succeeding, loneliness. Positive psychology can help, evidently based on all of these issues now. And there are outer physical and social inhibitors to learn and to influence. Unhealthy physical environments, depressing aesthetics, distractions, boring tasks, meaningless, senseless tasks, no-win game situations, teaching helplessness, win-lose game situations, producing losers, social conflict, narrowing thought action repertoire, and so on. Again, positive psychology has more and more documented evidence now telling us that we can help. A great article was done by Stuart Donaldson from Claremont and colleagues. It's just coming out in the Journal of Positive Psychology this month, I think, where they surveyed all peer-reviewed literature in respected journals within positive psychology from 2000 to 2013. So there you have a great overview of what the evidence tells us. And I'll conclude with a few positive psychology-related quotes also. Here's William A. Ward. The pessimist complains about the wind. The optimist expects it to change. The realist adjusts the sails. And finally, our hero. As I walked out the door towards my freedom, I knew that if I did not leave all the anger, hatred, and bitterness behind, that I would still be in prison. Thank you.